Hello, producers and music enthusiasts. Last week I talked about shaping your sound with envelopes and LFOs. This week we're talking all about harmonics and how to generate harmonics and how to shape harmonics, which gives you access to a much wider range of source tones, and it's the key to creating any kind of texture that you really want or need in your tracks. Without any further ado, let's get into it. So the first and most simple way to generate harmonics is through distortion. Okay, so if I add on a distortion, as I turn this up, you'll hear more harmonics starting to get introduced. And if I open up a spectrum analyzer, this is a pretty good free spectrum analyzer called Span, and it's really useful for seeing what's happening visually. So as you can see, single harmonic, but as I drive it, more overtones appear. It's got this soft edge because it's a softer type of distortion, but if I go into, let's say, hard clip, attach an LFO onto the drive here, and just set that to a bar, why not? And then resample it internally. You can see here that if I move the wavetable position, it'll get driven, and then as it hits the top, it starts to change the shape, and as it does that, it's getting these extra harmonics. And the distortion type greatly influences what type of tone is being generated. Here we have an asymmetric distortion. Soft clip. And as you heard before, hard clip. Which kind of squarifies this sine wave. And then we have a lot of really aggressive distortions that can mangle the sound a lot. So yeah, that's quite intense. The next way of generating harmonics is to go into the wavetable editor and draw in harmonics manually. The harmonics series multiplies the frequency by 2 each time it steps up one of these bins. If I add in a second harmonic and remove the first one, you can see that it's just a sine wave happening twice. Then if I add in the next one, it's happening 3 times, and so on and so forth. When you stack them together, you can see that it's adding in those extra overtones and changing the shape of the sound, which is how a speaker is able to represent a whole band worth of instruments with just a single speaker cone, because each sound that you add on sums into a single waveform that a speaker can then represent. Like I mentioned in the first video, a speaker just follows the path of whatever waveform is being played. With a sine wave, it's just going smoothly out and then smoothly in. But if I add in these overtones, then the speaker is doing much more movement. And this way you can generate whatever kind of tones that you like. So there we got something that sounds more bell-like. This gets really interesting when you start to drive these extra harmonics into distortion. So if I go on maybe asymmetric, clear this back down to a sine wave, and then just put in an overtone. can see that it's generating harmonics based on the input. So whatever you feed into the distortion is going to change the way that it behaves. So that's a really useful way of shaping sounds, because you can just search for the tones that you want simply by feeding in different harmonics. On this bottom half of the bins, you have the phases, which is at what point the waveform starts its cycle. If I show you on the overall oscillation, the phase is this line here, which is the point where the waveform starts its cycle. If I bring the random phase down, then it will always start at the same phase position. It's a very subtle thing, but you can get different tones by manipulating the phases of these individual harmonics. So that's, again, another way of sculpting the tone that you want. So pretty much any sound is composed of harmonics and phase relationships. Different sounds just have different combinations of harmonic volumes and phase positions for those harmonics. Another way of generating harmonics is FM synthesis, which is quite complicated to explain, but I'm going to do my best. FM basically works in a way that the frequency of one waveform is affecting the frequency of a second waveform. And if I set up an FM modulation here, and I've turned down the volume for this second oscillator, so we're not actually hearing what it's doing, but it is being used as a modulation source. If I turn up this FM knob, you're going to be able to hear extra harmonics being added. And it can get very intense very fast, especially if you use more complicated waveforms. To explain this in an easier way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn down the octave of the modulator to something that is slower than an audible rate. It becomes a more rhythmic thing, and you can then hear what it's doing. You can hear it start to wobble. If I turn it down even further, it'll be more pronounced. You can hear that pitch wobble. If the frequency of the modulation source is greater than the carrier, what happens is the pitch modulation happens within a single cycle, therefore changing the wave shape, adding more harmonics. If I assign a ramp on the FM knob and then resample it into the oscillator, if I scrub through the wavetable position, you can see what's happening to the waveform. So it's got a point where it's pitching up, and then a point where it's pitching down, and a point where it's pitching up, and it goes so on and so forth like that. So you can hear the effect gets intensified the more FM that we have. And that's quite intense. Another thing that we can do is we can utilize our envelopes to change this FM over time, which gives us a lot more variation in the harmonics. And then we can further shape the harmonics with filters, which are a subtractive form of synthesis, which means that we're cutting away what's already there. If we put another envelope on this filter and maybe make it a steeper filter, we can get more harmonics at the beginning, and then they taper off towards the end. Which is just so satisfying. With FM, the things that affect it most are what frequency the modulator is at. If I take off the modulation and just show you the static tone. So if I turn this octave down to match the carrier, we get a deeper tone, because what happens is if you FM with a modulator that's lower, the original carrier doesn't change pitch as much. But if you bring the octave up, it'll actually affect the bass frequency of the carrier. If I turn it up even further, we have an even more intense effect. And then once again further, and now we're getting into dubstep territory. So there's so many different tones that can be generated from this. And as well, if you manipulate not even the octave, but the semitones, it can create much different sounds. If we go up 7 semitones, which is a perfect fifth interval, as opposed to just... You have so much control over what harmonics are actually being generated from this. You can get really dissonant sounds if you just slightly fine-tune it. It starts to get really unstable. It depends on what you're going for, really. With sine waves, you can utilize almost the full range of FM and still have a very usable sound. The more complicated the modulating waveform is, the quicker the waveform becomes really messy and becomes more and more like white noise. If I load in a saw wave, show what that does. If I turn this up, you can see how much quicker it becomes chaotic. Especially if the carrier waveform is more complicated also. Let's say if it's a square wave. It becomes really complicated. Let's say if we go with something that's already very harmonically rich and then turn up this modulation. You can hear how it gets super messy. But sometimes you want something that's quite chaotic, so you can then cut away afterwards. So it's really based on what you're actually trying to achieve. The other thing really important to keep in mind with FM, the difference in tone based on where the wavetable is set at. So let me just get another wavetable here. Let's go with maybe a triangle. I've got the random phase turned down on both oscillators, so they're always starting at the same phase position. Let me get something more complicated for the modulator. Pay attention to the difference in tone when I alter the phase of one of these. Keep that in mind and use that to your advantage when creating your sounds. What I'm going to do to finish off is show a practical example of how you would use these techniques. So let's start off with clearing the oscillator. I'm also going to turn on the distortion immediately, which is going to be really informative of how these different harmonics that I'm adding are affecting the sound. So let's just go with that for now. And then let's get a second oscillator. And I'm just going to give this some harmonics as well. And then I'm going to play with the FM. Quite like that. And then if I play with the phase as well. I'm going to then add some filtering so I can sculpt the sound a bit further. If I get a second envelope to control the volume. Nice, sounding good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add another envelope, a nice short one, onto the FM so I can have it be a little bit more plucky at the beginning. A bit less than that. So that sounds pretty nice to me. Finally, this is just an extra trick for if you're making a plucked sound, is you can add a really short envelope on the master tuning, which is going to give it a really nice thump at the beginning of your sound. If I attach LFO 1 onto the global and then master tuning and set this to unipolar, this little arrow indicates if the modulation goes both ways or if it's just one way. So we want just unipolar here, which means that this bottom line is the starting pitch, and then this is just going to be going one way. Whereas if it was on bipolar, then this middle line here becomes the default pitch, and then it will be pitching down and going to too low of a frequency. So if I have it on bipolar, then turn up the pitch, you can hear how it gets really low at the end and just completely falls apart. But on unipolar, it's going to settle at its original frequency. And you can hear how it's got that really thick punch now. So that sounds pretty good to me. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're FMing from a high frequency, sometimes, as I said before, it can pitch up this oscillator. If I wanted to make sure that the low end is preserved on this modulator, what I can do is I can take the lowest harmonic out, maybe normalize this. Then I can put in a separate sub assigned to this volume envelope. And now we have a nice solid low end. So that brings us to the end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed or learned something. If you want to see more stuff like this, please consider subscribing, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.